Ladies and gentlemen, thanks for coming back to the podcast. My special guest today is a longtime friend who's a big fan of the arts, a thespian in his own right, a reporter in his own right, and a pastor in his own right of the Global Methodist Church. Mark Fleming, good to have you on.
Good to be here.
So, as I said, Mark, we've known each other for quite a while. I think we first met over at the when you were working at the Pasadena Citizen and me at the Deer Park Broadcaster newspapers for
Yes.
Houston community newspapers years ago, and we've developed a friendship and have been friends ever since. And I've enjoyed our friendship. So let's start there, Mark. I want to cover three different subjects with you, and we talked a little bit previous to the interview starting about that. We want to cover journalism, which is what I know you as more than anything else, and then we're going to get into the arts and then faith as well. So how did you get into journalism?
First interest I remember having is when I was in junior high school. My mother wrote a book on local history in the town I grew up in Nederland. And watching her do the interviews, and then she actually let me do proofreading and copy editing. And I just got really fascinated by that. And then got into it in high school. I did have an uncle who was a newspaper editor. I don't remember that having an influence, but it may have. But I always just thought it was cool, and it it really just seemed like where I needed to be.
Hmm. Okay. Now, did you go to school for it? I don't remember if you told me you went to school for journalism.
Yes, yes. I went to college planning to be a journalist and majored in journalism, and it was during the time in college that I felt the call to ministry. So kind of got sidetracked, but honestly, always thought I'd get back to it.
Hmm.
And
I
I
know
did.
that I know those two disciplines did overlap. Like you were just saying.
Yes.
Yeah. So when you were not to segue off into faith too quickly into the interview, but we're
Right.
going to certainly come back to that. But when you were developing that interest in journalism, you after you got your degree in it, how long was it before you actually started working for a newspaper?
I had, of course, worked for the student newspaper in college and did a summer internship at a newspaper. But then, as far as working professionally for a paper, it was another, well, I did 21 years in ministry and then left that to pursue journalism.
Okay. Okay. Now, in the years that you worked for the Pasadena paper in particular, I
Yes.
know you covered law enforcement, city council, you did some human interest stuff as well, but what did you enjoy the most about working over there? What did you like to cover more than anything else?
Anything hard news, um, crime coverage. I did several environmental stories there. Some of those carried over to when I was at the Baytown newspaper and city council, city government. Um, I I'm definitely the hard news kind of person, not the human interest feature. Though I can do those and have done many of them.
Yeah. I know there's something to be said about covering particularly city politics and a police beat. And I know years ago they would have had of course this is before my time when newspapers had a bigger staff. You would have someone that would just be assigned to a police department and they would pretty much stay there throughout the day or visit there
Yes,
throughout the day to pick up different scoops. They would have, those police blotters that they would read and pick up leads and stuff like that.
yes.
And I know just in talking to people when you and I both worked in that area, there was a lot of people who really respected what you were doing and being a fair and objective journalist. Unfortunately, we know these days that a lot of journalists have kind of lost their way, and that's the biggest criticism with the media is it's too biased. Which obviously there's going to be a little bit of bias. I mean, we're humans. There's
Right.
certain slants that we have, but some of us can put most of that aside, and some people can't. What do you think, Mark, that it takes to become a trusted uh, reporter in a city like the size of Pasadena, which is about 150,000 people?
I think the biggest thing it takes, and this is where I think most I think most companies that own newspapers have no clue how to run newspapers, and that's the biggest problem. Is that you've got to be there. I mean, the only way to write credibly is to have good information. And the only way to get good information is to have sources who trust you. And that takes time building relationships. You know, um, I spent a lot of hours talking with and listening to police officers and police public information people. And it required a lot of them knowing that I wasn't going to embarrass them just for the sake of embarrassing them, but I also wasn't going to let them get by with shallow answers.
Mm-hmm. Uh, we had covered several press conferences, and you'd have local personalities come from the Houston community. I won't give them any credit on this podcast, but people would know who they are. They're pretty popular. When bad news happens, you'll see them pop up on the TV screen. But how do you maintain your own discipline when you're surrounded in those types of press conferences with cults of personality and the shining TV camera lights and everything like that, and you're the local journalist with the keypad, with the notepad and maybe the cell phone or a little bit of recorder there. You're the one that's seeing these people all the time, and these folks that are coming from the bigger news agencies and the TV stations are coming in, and they really only show up there to cover the bad news. How do you
Right.
Parse telling a good story with not getting caught up with kind of how they do journalism?
On the stories I did that got Houston media interest, I always tried to differentiate it by getting depth of background that they didn't have. I would make a point of coming into the press conference, being able to ask questions that they weren't able to ask because they didn't know the community. And then in the stories, be able to include information so that anyone reading it would know that my story had a depth of knowledge that the TV stations did not have.
Mm-hmm. You weren't out for the 10-second soundbite. Your story had a lot more
Right.
meat to it. Yeah.
Right.
Mm-hmm. Going back over that time in your life, were there any stories that you covered that were more memorable than others? Do you think about any of those to this day?
One of the most interesting to me was an environmental story that we had a man doing illegal dumping into the ship channel, and I was surprised that after I'd done several stories about it, he actually was willing to talk to me. And I got his side of it, which was, portraying him honestly did not make him look good. And he was not someone who was a good person, but it was interesting that he was willing to talk on the record. And I fairly represented things he said, and let readers take from it what was there.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I remember the one thing I remember a lot of good memories working with you over there, but one that I think about all the time, Mark, and I don't know if you remember this or not, but I was writing a story. It was something to do with maybe cancer awareness or smoking. I don't know what it was, but I needed a picture, and your hand was my cover art. Remember, we went across the street, that little park, and we sat down on
Okay.
that bench, and you had a cigarette in your hand, and I leaned
Okay.
over you, and I took a picture of a lit. I have to find it on the internet somewhere. I took a picture of a
I
hand with a lit
Yeah.
cigarette.
No, I didn't
You don't
remember
remember
that.
that?
Funny.
Yeah,
No.
yeah, yeah.
No.
So going from Pasadena to Baytown, well, what were the parallels and what were the differences in news coverage over there? Was it more or less the same thing with different faces, or was there a different slant, a different emphasis?
The biggest difference to me that I noticed, and this changed during my time in Baytown, is that Pasadena had already come to terms with being part of an urban area. They understood what it meant to be an urban suburb, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
And when I went to Baytown, the city leadership understood that, but a lot of the citizens still wanted to pretend that it was not really part of that Houston stuff, and try to recreate the small town days that just weren't going to be there anymore.
Hmm. I know talking to you when you were working for the Baytown Sun during that time, there were some stories you were working on, some big stuff. You covered a lot of the same beats, the city beats and city council and stuff. Also, environmental type stories
Yeah.
because of the Exxons and the different Bayer and different
Yeah.
companies that you had over there. What were some of the stories that were memorable to you over there compared to Pasadena?
Uh, well, one that was the same was the San Jacinto waste pits, which was
Right.
uh, cool because that became a super fun site while I was at the Pasadena newspaper, and I started covering it there, and then went on to cover it for another 12 years in Baytown, going through that. And of course, the biggest story I covered there was they did have a police involved shooting, where an African American woman was killed.
Hmm.
And this was right when all a lot of that was getting national publicity. And it just, as I was in, the parking lot across the street with all the other media there, early morning hours, trying to frame how to cover that story, I was very aware that I had the opportunity to set a lot of the tone for the way the story was going to be covered.
Hmm.
And did not want to do anything to make Baytown be another Ferguson. And that meant, for one thing, telling both sides of the story, but also it meant really pushing to make sure the police department was being open and honest, because the worst thing they could have done was circle the wagons and pretend it wasn't happening.
Hmm. A lot of people want to know, Mark, what's the life of a journalist like? Now, we weren't working in major market
Right.
newspapers, but probably mid-sized market, small market. Um, what was the day in the life for you? I know what it's like, but for people who don't know, give them some insight on sort of the day to day.
My my routine was to start in the morning, and of course, there's a lot of pressure to produce a lot of copy. So first thing, outline my stories for the day, send out emails to everyone I need to talk to, and then after I get through that, double back and start going story by story, telephoning people that didn't respond by email, and trying to get information, and where it meant going out in person, trying to set that up in advance, but sometimes doing it that day. And then morning was initial contact, midday was doing interviews, online, by phone, in person, and then typically about 3 or 4 in the afternoon, start actually writing and get the stories turned in.
Hmm. Hmm. What do you think is the one thing that today's journalists, and maybe even journalists in the past, underestimated about the responsibilities they have as a journalist? I've got my own opinion on that. What do you think?
In my experience, journalists tend to be pretty philosophical.
Hmm.
So I think most of the ones I've known take it very seriously,
Hmm.
and and um, know the value of getting it right and being fair and keeping yourself out of the story.
Right. Yeah. And I guess never underestimating the power of what your words can do, to what you can influence in a good way and a bad way. I think about that a lot when I'm writing stories. I know you do as well. Um, what do you miss about it? I know you haven't worked for the paper in a little bit. What, a couple of years now?
Right.
Yeah,
Well, no, just over a year.
about a year.
And
Okay.
I miss the interaction and I miss the learning. I think to me the most fun thing about it was you're always learning something new and always getting to learn quirky things that, you know go up to the top of the tower at a power generation plant. I never would have thought of what goes into generating electricity and to keep the plants from freezing like they did during winter storm. But I got to go on a tour plant to see how they had responded to that. So
Hmm.
just always fun stuff.
You talked earlier about you going to school for journalism and then ministry. You found a calling towards ministry. Now, where we'll discuss the faith part here in just a little bit, but where did the interest in theater come from?
I'd always loved attending live theater. And my older brother and his daughter were real active in live theater. And that that got me seeing a little more of the behind the scenes part of it. And then I guess when I was about 30, someone um, I was kind of feeling burned out, and someone suggested, "What have you always wanted to do that you've never had the nerve to do?" And I thought, I know what that is. So I got in touch with someone I knew who was involved in community theater, and they were directing a show, lined me up for a small part, and I've been in it ever since.
Hmm. Now, just like in journalism, you're telling stories, obviously, and in theater, you're either interpreting a fable or a myth, or maybe it's a reenactment of an event that happened. In your
Yes.
mind, Mark, we're going to touch on two bases here. One, what makes a good theatrical play? What makes a good story there? But also going back to journalism, what makes a good story? Because they do kind of tie together a little bit in tandem there.
And just like I prefer hard news in journalism, I prefer drama in theater. Um, I've done comedy. I have no musical ability, but I've been in musicals and done production work in musicals. But to me, the commonality is that even if the story in theater is fictional, good theater tells the truth
Hmm.
and reveals something about people.
Hmm.
And that's the commonality.
Okay. Okay. And working in those productions like that, I know you've done quite a bit of stuff with the Baytown Little Theater. Were there other theater companies you worked with as well?
Um, I started out the first time I lived in Beaumont with Port Arthur Little Theater,
Okay.
and was involved with that for several years. And then when I moved to Channelview, I called around to find out where I could get involved. And the first place that I ended up was Baytown, and I stayed.
Okay. Now I know you did some, not just acted in theater, but you did some direction and you said you did some
Yes.
production work as well.
Yes.
For people who don't really know a lot about how theater works, what role does that director have, and how integral is it? Are the responsibilities that they have on them to making this play presentable to the public?
The director is the play.
Okay.
And I had not realized that until I got into theater, is that if if you've got a good, strong director and you've got good actors, literally the director controls every word, every facial expression, every movement that happens on stage.
Hmm.
And
Okay. Now can the term director and dictator go hand in hand sometimes?
when I've directed plays, I've sometimes started out by telling my cast that, I'm not one of the directors who believes that I'm God, because God shows mercy. Uh, so yeah, and and that's something that was interesting dealing with in community theaters, because we had some directors who went overboard, but really the most demanding directors who were rational were also the most popular with actors, because you can trust them to produce a good show,
Hmm.
and you will get mad at them, you will be angry with them every show, you will swear you will never work with them again, but when the show ends up good, you appreciate it.
Do you think, Mark, that brings up a really interesting point, because whether it's a director or a teacher or anyone that's imparting instruction and direction,
Right.
or it could be your editor at the newspaper or your boss or whatever, people will tolerate pardon my French, a prick if they
Right.
get results. If
Exactly.
they're if and then if they get results, then they start to build the respect amongst the
Right.
people. Do you think that they get away with that because they get the results? And if they didn't get the results, those are the ones that people will not put up with?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Hmm.
Yeah. Yeah. I can think of I can think of a couple of directors I've worked with who, um, no one would ever tolerate the way they work when they're directing if they weren't so awesome.
Hmm.
And they know what they're doing, and they know what makes a good show.
Hmm. So someone might get the idea, well, if I can bark orders and get just a few people to listen to me, I'd be a good director. In your opinion, Mark, what makes a good director and what makes a bad one? Is it just the respect and the results at the end of the day, or are there other abilities and characteristics a good director must possess to be successful?
A good director, the difference between them and a dictator is that even though the director always has the final decision, a good director will listen to the cast and will adapt their vision to the capabilities and suggestions of the people they're working with. If you get a director, and I've seen these, who just tell everyone, be creative, do what you want, you might get good individual performances, but you don't have a good show because it's not cohesive. But also, if you get a director who's absolutely set in doing it one way and not varying from that, you get a show that's very wooden and doesn't have life to it.
Hmm.
So the good director has to be able to direct, but also adapt.
Okay. Now, the days of the small community theaters, they're still here. We still obviously still
Yes.
have community theaters, but it seems like they've certainly been on the decline over years. I know just in my area, there's been one or two that used to be a staple in the area that are no longer with us. Have you seen that trend in kind of your neck of the woods, as it were, or is it going up, down, staying the same? What do you think about the future of community theater?
Um, Baytown was very unique, and they had a very, very strong community theater that is faces the same challenges as everyone else, but I think is more on an incline than a decline. I I've seen the ones fail, and I mean they fail. I think for the same reason that so many newspapers fail, is that you just lose the lose the life and lose the passion.
Hmm. And a lot of and that's a good segue back to journalism for a minute. I know that as you just said, a lot of newspapers fail, and just like community theater, I think overall is probably taking a little bit of a dive. Newspapers have taken a huge dive. What do you think could be credited with the demise of the local community paper? Is it just bad leadership? Is it just what you said? Just maybe losing your way, losing your focus is getting people turned off to the paper, or are there other elements that should be considered?
All of those. I think people like to blame the internet, which is kind of ridiculous because that's kind of like, well, all that is a format. If you're if you're doing if you're producing valuable content, you should be able to transfer from one manner of distribution to another without having extreme loss. It's a loss of focus. It's a failure to realize what advantages that the local media medium has that the national doesn't. And you've got to be rabidly committed to your community if you want to make it viable. It's so easy to go to cheaper content that isn't really community focused, which eliminates your entire reason for existence.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I know one criticism I would the paper got when I first started. I went around and I made my contacts with people in Deer Park that I was covering, and the universal sentiment was stop running Pasadena stuff in the Deer Park newspaper.
Yeah.
And I thought, okay, well that makes perfect sense. Why would you put stuff from another city unless there's a cross city tie or something like that?
Right.
One thing affects the other. But that's a good point. They wanted someone that's going to be there at those events, and that's
Right.
one thing that they would always say is like, you show up. You show up. That's why we like it. You're there. When we look around, we see the local news media there. And I know you went to all the events in Pasadena. I went to all the events in Deer Park, and yeah, I would agree with you there. So, Mark, we've hinted around a little bit about we've talked about journalism and theater, and we keep hinting about faith. We've had quite a few conversations over the years of faith, and that was one thing that got you off the journalism track a little bit in college. And so let's flesh that out. You said you discovered that in college. Talk about that discovery.
Going back before that, I had long before that, probably at about 12 or 13 years old, committed myself to serving God and serving in the Methodist Church. And I simply did not see that as happening in pastoral ministry. So it wasn't completely new because I already had very much in mind that my primary service was serving God, and journalism seems to be the path. And then when I was in college, I was very involved in the campus ministry and started realizing that there were things that I could do in the local church that were good and I might want to pursue. That just continued to develop, and I felt that that's what I was being called to. Though I will say that even as I was going through the interview process, and at that time I was in the United Methodist Church, and they have a very long process.
Okay.
I went through it rather quickly, and it was about 5 years from start to finish, and it's multiple rounds of interviews and then a couple of years and more interviews. And I remember in one of those saying that I believed I was called to the pastoral ministry, but really did not believe that that was where I'd be forever.
Okay. And so where did you take the seminary classes at, the seminary school?
I spent 1 year at Perkins School of Theology at SMU in Dallas, and then I transferred to Bright Divinity School at TCU in Fort Worth. Weird thing, during all that time, I worked in production at a church newspaper and called United Methodist Reporter. And that's actually how I chose seminary. I decided whether my choice was, did I want to work at a church newspaper or at a church book publisher? And if I'd worked at a book publisher, I would have gone to seminary at another location.
Okay. So those first years as a pastor, once you get through all the training and I'm assuming you're assigned a church, or do you pick a church, or how does that work?
In the United Methodist Church, it was strictly assigned.
Okay.
So
Hmm.
you go where you're sent.
You go where you're sent. And so where were you sent first, Mark?
Marshall, Texas.
Okay. All right.
Uh,
Okay. Yeah.
that-
Yeah. And so those first years that you're a pastor, what were I guess some of the things that you experienced that made you maybe think, man, I'm glad I got some training for this. I'm glad I got some prep for this because I wasn't expecting that, whatever that may have been.
The first church I pastored had a reputation for eating ministers alive.
Okay.
And so I was really grateful for a lot of, really just these survival strategies that they taught, and the stuff they taught about pastoral care that helps understand why people do what they do, and stuff about church, just managing a church and growing a church to try to turn that around some.
Hmm. Was it what you thought it was going to be when, let's say looking 5 years back, once you'd been full-time pastor for 5 years and you looked back and you took a little assessment of the situation, was it what you thought, or was it better? Was it worse? Was it, just you were sort of indifferent?
I don't know that I'd had a lot of expectations of what it was going to be like.
Mm-hmm.
Overall, I think it was more interesting than I expected it to be.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, interesting is one of those words. It's not entirely good, but it was more positive than negative. But there was definitely a lot more intensity and variety than I had expected.
Okay. There's a lot of parallels, but I would imagine having never been a minister or anything like that myself, but just talking to you and others, there's a lot of parallels between interacting with people as a minister, and also interviewing them for a news story, being at events,
Yes.
being interspersed with a whoever may be at an event that you're covering for the paper, or working with a diverse cast on a theater stage.
Yes.
Yeah.
And one of the real commonalities between being a minister and a journalist, actually, I guess this is two things. One is that you're in the middle of a lot of things that you're also detached from.
Mm-hmm.
You're never really part of it, but you're in the middle of it. And the other is that you get to be a lot of places that not everyone gets to be.
Mm-hmm. I love that quote. You're never part of it, but you're in the middle of it. Yeah, that's absolutely true, at least from the journalistic point of view. So, what do you think helped you the most, Mark, in being able to be a pastor for all these years? Because you did, and we'll talk a little bit about the years you were in, and you were out for journalists, and you've recently come back. But looking at the big picture, what do you think has helped you endure this long? Because it's not an easy vocation.
Stubbornness helps. Just enjoying people. I like getting to know people, and I like learning.
Mm-hmm.
That and you have to keep learning.
Yeah.
And that I think is something that gets some clergy is expecting that something that worked 20 years ago or 10 years ago or last year is going to work today, and it doesn't.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So how long had you been a pastor, Mark, before you dedicated yourself to full-time journalism?
21 years.
Oh, that's right, 21 years. Okay.
Yes.
And then you wrote for a considerable amount of time, and then you recently, relatively recently, got back
Yes.
into the ministry?
Yes. I left the Baytown Sun in January of 2023, and not part of my motivation for leaving was wanting to get more involved in active ministry than I had been able to be with my hours at the newspaper. Full time ministry was not on my radar at all. And when I talked to my pastor about what I could do to get more involved, that's right when the United Methodist Church was splitting, and the church I attended had gone with the Global Methodist Church. And he said that at that time they had a lot of churches without pastors, and I was still an ordained elder in the United Methodist Church, and they recognized that, and they needed me to fill in gaps. So I spent several months just a lot of one Sunday assignments and a couple of longer term ones where I'd be, someplace for 8 or 10 weeks. And during that, it just started feeling right to go ahead and get back into it full time.
Hmm. So, what was the biggest change you noticed between when you were full time years ago, 20, 30 something years previous to when you're coming back in now? Not necessarily talking about the differences in the split, the denominations and stuff, but just the way you approached your ministerial duties.
I got a lot of confidence in journalism that I had not had before.
Right.
Because, as you know, when you're a journalist, you do a lot of just starting conversations with people who might not want to talk to you, and just taking whatever comes. and
Hmm.
and that helped me be a lot more just just made it a lot easier to get out there
Okay.
talking.
Okay. Now, Mark, whether it's journalism or pastoral work, do you think that those attributes, the ability to go up there and start conversations, knowing how to even do that, having the confidence to be able to walk up in the middle of a crowd and find the person you need to talk to, or just start interviewing random people, is that something that can be trained, or is that something that's innate in a person?
I think it can be trained.
Hmm.
There um there's probably some natural inclination, but I think you can learn it.
Hmm. Hmm. Okay. And so where are you pastoring currently? Where are you assigned now that you came back on full time?
Well, with the change in denominations, it's not quite the assignment it used to be.
Okay.
Now, the when a church needs a new pastor, the denomination will give them a short list of choices, and then they interview and make the decision. So there's more. Um, One of the leaders in the church recently said that it's gone from being an arranged marriage to being a dating service. But I am currently at two churches
Okay.
combined to make a full time position. So I'm at China Methodist Church in China, Texas, which
Okay.
is just west of Beaumont on Highway 90, and then Forest Park Methodist Church, that's right on the western edge of Beaumont.
Okay. So they don't sound like they're very far apart.
It is 9 miles, and it's an 11-minute drive, which on Sunday morning is tight. But I go from one to the other on Sunday morning.
Okay. Okay. Now, when you're not at church, conducting, the service and sermons and everything like that, What are the sort of the day-to-day duties of a pastor for people who don't know?
You visit people in the church, you visit people in the hospital, and of course, do weddings and funerals. We've had one funeral since I've been here, no weddings. My biggest priority right now is growing these churches. They're both very small, and neither one has been on the trajectory they want to be on as far as
Okay.
growth. And that's my task.
Okay. Now, growing anything in a relatively small area is difficult. Whether it's a business, a church, newspaper, it doesn't matter. It's because you have limited people. There may be other choices for whatever service or in your case, whatever church you may represent. How do you go and try to grow the churches in the environment that you're in?
A lot of that I'm still trying to figure out.
Hmm.
And I I am not a one size fits all person. There's not a magic formula where I I have pastored churches and church organizations through growth before, and it is spending enough time with people to learn what the need is in that place at that time,
Hmm.
and trying to meet needs that aren't being met.
Right. You don't have to look very far on social media or TV or anything, or even in the movies to see a trend away from certainly organized religion, but even really any hint of religious affiliation. Surely you've seen that as well. What I know you can attribute that to various phenomena in society, but what do you attribute that to, you personally?
Um, I really see it kind of like I see with newspapers. I think a lot of it is self-inflicted. That that we, I for more than half my ministry, I did ministry on college campuses, and people like to tell you about all the reasons that young people today aren't interested in Christianity. And if you deal with real live young people and pay attention to them, yes, they are. And I think you get a lot of the same thing in the local church, that there is um, you've got to figure out what they need.
Hmm. Hmm.
And yeah.
Yeah. It wasn't too long ago, I guess maybe 5 or 6 months ago, that you, myself, and Pastor Bob Barris of St. Bernadette Catholic Church in Clear Lake were having lunch at Red River Cantina over here in League City.
Yes.
And I'll tell you, Mark, if you'd asked me if that would have ever happened 10 years ago, I would have said there's no way. But, uh, you know, I have sort of been spiritually exploring for a little while now, and you and I have talked about that in various lunch
Yes.
events that we've had together. Not that I'm looking to leave my own faith. I love my faith, but I've always been interested in learning. I guess it's a journalist in me, learning more about the other faiths that I hear about, and I ended up
um,
befriending him like I have you. Yeah.
it might interest you to know that a couple hours ago I called the Catholic Church here in China to set up a time to talk to Father Polycarp about, they have a traditional sunrise service on Easter Sunday that the different churches participate in. And
Hmm.
so I need to get together with him to get the planning going for that.
Okay. Do you see a little bit more of a trend towards ecumenism as opposed to maybe when you first started in the ministry?
It has always been or at least in my lifetime, it's been a priority in Methodism. I think
Hmm.
I'm seeing it more in some other denominations that used to be less open to it.
Right. Do you think, with given the dwindling numbers, but then the social issues that we're facing, and you always go back to strength in numbers. Do you think that we'll see more of that? Even if it's just because of the strength in numbers argument that we need to find the things that we have in common to help maybe beat back some of the more secular tendencies that are going out there in the world.
I don't I don't see that personally as a motivation. I think the um, personally, I've always leaned toward building faith communities and trusting that that will shape society rather than taking shaping society as a goal.
Mm, okay. I only ask that question because I hear a lot of people, well, they'll say, well, if there's a lot of different faiths that are pro-life, so let's just all band together. We may not agree on other things, but the things that we agree on, we need to get on board, and we need to fight these fights that are coming up, because we're losing in some aspects. They think we're losing. Maybe we are, maybe we're not. I don't know, but yeah, I wanted to get your take on that. So going forward, I know you haven't been in your current location all that long, but how do you see the next couple of years shaping up? What are some of your goals over there where you're at now?
Um, I'm still trying to get to know the communities at one of my churches. We literally got a meeting tomorrow to start a long range planning committee to set a vision for where they want their church to be in 2030,
Hmm.
and what we have to do to get from here to there.
Hmm.
And that's um, in the places I've been pastor that it's worked well. I don't feel like I know what's going on until I'm in about my third year.
Hmm.
It takes time to get acclimated and get things moving in the right direction.
That reminds me of all the people that we both have interviewed for city council. If they're first timers and they say, well,
Yes,
I'm just going to go in there for one term, maybe two terms, and I'm done. And then about
right.
two terms in, they're in their reelection, and they say, well, I just figured out where the bathroom's at. You
Exactly.
know,
Exactly.
there's a lot. In other words, there's a lot more to it than what people think. Yeah.
Right. Right. And yeah, and a lot of people do go into politics very naive. They
Mhm.
uh, uh, they think they understand what's going on, and they don't have a clue.
Could you say the same thing about ministers?
Oh yes, yes, and that's why I don't like prefabricated solutions. You know, you don't
Mhm.
um, you, you don't know what the solution to the problem is until you really understand what the problems are and what the resources are and what the challenges are.
Mhm. You deal, you like any pastor or minister or priest, you're dealing with the beginning, the middle, and end of life.
Right.
People have there's no telling what's inside your head as far as questions you've been asked, situations you found yourself in, questions on how to get out of those situations, what's the best answer for this question. Um, how do you keep it all, I guess, evenly spaced out in your head? Because I could just imagine some of the stuff that you may have gone through. Just if you let that accumulate, you let that fester, that could really cause you some problems, I would think. How do you keep
Right.
a level head going through being a pastor?
Well, that goes back to one of the things I talked about earlier. That's why I got into theater.
That's your
Was
therapy,
to
huh?
exactly you've got to have something outside the ministry to reset, as it were.
Hmm. Advice you have for anyone who's interested in taking their faith and turning it into a vocation, whether it's being a minister or just maybe just more involved in their church. Maybe they don't want to be a minister, but they want to be a deacon or an elder or song leader or something like that, but they want a role of responsibility. What would you tell them before they get involved?
Um, Make sure you want to serve.
Yeah. Have a servant's heart. Yeah.
Yeah.
Not have ulterior motives. Yeah, that's
Yes.
true. Yeah. Well, very good. Well, do you see yourself doing any more writing or any more theater work as you get more settled down where you're at now in your church?
Oh yes, I definitely plan to get into the theater as uh, I'm going to give it a few months to make sure that I don't get overcommitted. But
Mm,
I've got uh, members of my churches who have contacts in the theater community who've already started uh, expressing a willingness to help me make introductions and stuff. And as far as writing, what I really want to do is try to get more involved in writing within the church community um, rather than I've thought about doing freelancing on secular news, which I certainly could do and may end up doing, but I really would like to. Uh, I've always wanted to combine the writing with ministry in ways that I never had the opportunity to do very
mm.
deeply.
Well, the Beaumont Enterprise is right down the road. Maybe you could be the religion editor or a religion columnist for them.
Um, Years ago, I actually interviewed them
Oh,
about maybe doing that position. It ended up not happening, but yeah.
hmm. Very good. Well, Mark, I think we're going to leave it there. I appreciate you coming on and sharing some of your experiences with journalism and theater and faith. And I know personally, I have my own preachers in my churches that I look up to, but I've always kind of considered you as kind of like my secondary pastor in a way. You have definitely helped me navigate some very difficult times, and I can't thank you enough for the counsel you've given me.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Okay. God bless, Mark.
You too.